Everybody, thanks for joining the Intermediate and Advanced Spring Track. We have another great session for you today. Please welcome Angie Jones as she tells us what to look forward to beyond Java 8.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Angie Jones, and I love Java. I teach free courses at Test Automation University, including a Java programming course. So if you know anyone who wants to learn core Java, send them over there. It's free. Selenium WebDriver with Java, visual testing with Java, and a couple of others as well. Now, while Java is still the leading programming language, yay, it's gotten a bad rep over the years, right? So some of the biggest gripes that I hear are things like Java is too verbose. Yeah, we do have to write a lot of code sometimes to do the most basic things, right? Another one that I hear is that the language was not evolving fast enough. True, the releases of Java 7, 8, and 9 were all 3 years apart, which is almost a lifetime when we talk about software development. Fortunately, the powers that be have heard us loud and clear, and Java has gotten a much needed makeover. And now new versions of the language are being released every 6 months. Now, with so many new features, it can be hard to keep up. So, in this talk, what I want to do is to demonstrate some of the newer features of Java and how we can take advantage of them when writing our code. So, we're going to look at some test code today for verifying this banking page. And the specific test that we'll go over today is just going to make sure that all of these accounts are actually listed. So here's our test code, and let me walk you through this. So here we are logging into the application, and we get a handle to this accounts overview page. And this is where that table of accounts that we just saw, this is where that's located. Next, we get a list of the account numbers that are displayed on the page. Then we want to get the expected accounts. So this test data can change. So we're actually making a call to an API to get the expected accounts. And this returns a list of deserialized account objects. So we want to make a new list, which will only contain the account numbers as strings as opposed to the entire account. We're going to loop through the list of account objects and then add the account number from each account into our list of expected accounts. And then finally, we compare both of these lists to make sure that every account for this customer is actually shown on the site. Now, this test was written in Java 8. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through it and see how we can modernize it using some of the latest features in Java. All right, ready? Okay. So let's start here with the declaration of the accounts overview page. As you can see, we're following Java conventions. We're using good names for both our class and our object. However, many times, as we can see here, these two names end up being the same thing, right? So this is redundant. It makes for a lot of typing. So in version 10 of Java, type inference for local variables was introduced. And what this means is that instead of explicitly declaring the object or the variable's type, we can instead use the keyword var. And Java will infer what the type is based on what is being assigned to it. So this is my favorite new feature in Java because in test code especially, we always have like these long class names for our page models. And now we no longer need to type these things out. Now, before you get carried away and start using var everywhere, let me explain the rules and also give you some tips. So this does not make Java a dynamically typed language like JavaScript or Python. Okay, that was the first thing I thought when I saw this, like, whoa, wait a minute. Is Java changing before my eyes? The type is still there. It's just inferred from the right-hand side of the statement, which means you can only use var if you're actually initializing the variable. Otherwise, Java will not be able to infer what its type is, right? That makes sense. Also, it only works for local variables. So you can use this inside of methods, loops, decision structures, but you cannot use this for global variables, even if you're initializing them. Now, while the local variable type inference can be used inside the body of local constructs, it can't be used inside of headers of methods or constructors. This is because if we really think about this, whoever's calling you or your method or your constructor needs to know the data type of the arguments that they need to send, right? Okay, so those are the rules. Now let's get into some guidelines. Now, given this variable name and this method name, I have no idea what the inferred data type of X would be. Sure, Java knows, yes, right? But me, as the reader, I can't easily tell what this is. So this makes it kind of difficult to work with this variable. Now, you should always use good variable names, but it's even more important if you're going to use var because we're losing a bit of context here, right? So once you start using this, you're going to love it, but please don't overdo it. So for example, using var here, this does nothing for you. This doesn't do you any favors, right? Just type int. Int is 3 letters, var is 3 letters, don't overdo it. Okay, so I've updated our test method to use vars. So I'm using var here, and the inferred data type is very clear to me as the reader because of the variable name that I chose. So yay me. However, here I needed to change the variable name from actual accounts to actual accounts IDs list so that it's clear that this is a list and it's holding the account IDs. For this one, I also changed the name from accounts to accounts list so that it's clear this is a list holding account objects. Here, I changed the name to be more representative, and I also explicitly defined the data type of the array list on the right-hand side. If I didn't use this diamond operator to indicate that this is a list of strings, what's going to happen is it's going to be inferred as a list of objects, which is okay. In this case, I'm not doing too much, but this could get me into trouble down the road. For example, this is supposed to be a list of strings. If I were to go in this list and get one of the objects and, use the dot operator wanting to invoke one of its methods, then Java thinks it's an object. So I don't see those string methods there. Okay, so that's why I had to explicitly define that there. And then here, I'm using var inside of a for loop just to show you that it can be done. All right, so let's see what else we can modernize. How about we go inside of this get accounts method? Now remember, this is the table, and we're getting all of those values in the first column labeled account. So here's the code that does that. And we see here, it finds all of the account sales, right? These are web element objects. Then it creates a new list to hold just the text of the web element. So this is a list of strings. And then to populate that list, we loop through each of the elements from line 3. We get their text, and then we add them to our new line on 6. And then notice this method needs 2 lists and a loop. So there's a more modern approach to do this in Java by using a functional programming style. So this approach was actually added in Java 8, but I don't see it used much in test code. So I wanted to highlight it really quickly. So this is much more streamlined. I think we all can agree. Here, we still call find elements to get the list of web elements, but we don't need to store them. Instead, we turn them into a stream from which we can do some cool functional programming. So this map function will take those web elements and map them into whatever is passed into this call. So here we're saying get the text from the web elements and then store them into a list, which we return. So here's an alternative way to write that map call. Notice in the top example, line 5 uses a shortcut or syntactic sugar, but in the bottom example, line 3 uses the fully spelled out approach with the arrow. Okay, so we can do the same in our test method. So instead of using the to list in a for loop, I use a stream and then map what I need into this single list. It's a good practice to break up these chain method calls where each method is on a new line. It's really tempting to do this big, powerful call all on one line. I know, because it's like, wow, look at this wicked one-liner, right? But what that does is makes it harder to read your code and to process what it's actually doing. So it's a good practice to break it up so that each call is on a new line. And it also helps if you need to like debug your code. So some of the IDEs, I know IntelliJ does, will allow you to put breakpoints on these method calls, these chain method calls, if you break them up like this. Okay, so let's look at what's new with streams beyond Java 8. So Java 9 introduces a couple of new methods to stream, one being take while. Now let's say I have this code which gets the list of accounts and then uses the take while method on the stream of accounts. Within this take while method, you pass in a condition, also known as a predicate. And this is saying to go through this list of accounts, accept all of the ones that have a type of checking until you get to one that does not have this type. So here are all of the accounts that are stored in accounts list. Notice there's 11 of them. And when we say take while type is checking, we end up with a list of 3 accounts. And as you can see, it's the first 3 accounts from the accounts list. But when it gets to the 4th account, the type was savings, so the stream has ended. Okay. Java 9 also introduced drop while, which does the opposite of take while. For this one, we're saying drop the accounts of type checking until you get to one that's not. So with 11 accounts here, we see the first 3 are checking, the 4th is savings, the 5th through 9th are checking, the 10th is savings, and the last one is checking. So how many accounts do you think will be collected in checking accounts list? Go ahead and take a guess. If you said 8, you are correct. So this method dropped the first 3 accounts because they matched the predicate, and then it stopped the stream. So all other accounts are collected and then stored into a list. Now, all of those accounts couldn't fit on the last slide, so here's a full list of drop while account type is checking. All right, so you might be thinking, why on earth, Angie, would I want to use take while or drop while, right? The examples that I showed you were a bit of a brain tease because the lists weren't sorted. So the results were indeterministic. However, if you sort the collection first, as we're doing here, it makes a lot more sense. Notice I'm using this comparator to specify which property I want this object sorted by. So the type from account. And given this sorted list, we see that it collects all of the checking accounts. And now this actually makes more sense. Likewise for drop while. Okay, good. All right, let's see what else we can modernize. How about let's look inside of this get customer ID method. So this method, it's holding our test data, and based on the name on the account, it's returning the account ID. So this is using switch statements, and notice we have to declare the variable. Then we specify each case that we want to handle. And inside of the case, we assign the value to ID. And then we must follow the assignment with a break statement to prevent fall through into the next case, which would override the variable, right? So not only is this a lot of boilerplate code, but it's also risky. If you forget one of those break statements, this is going to return the wrong ID. In fact, I did that a couple of weeks ago, not in Java. I was coding in PHP, and I was getting the wrong result. And I couldn't figure out why that was until I saw, oh, duh, I'm using the switch. And I forgot my break statements, right? We've probably all done this at some point. Don't judge me. All right. Good news for Java. Java 12, switch expressions were introduced. Now, you can use switch directly to assign a value to a variable. And notice here, we are using switch on the right side of the statement to initialize the variable. The case statement doesn't need a colon in switch expressions, but instead it uses an arrow. And this is saying if the name is John, then assign 12212 to the variable ID. Okay, notice I don't need a break statement. There is no fall through in switch expressions. Gasp, right? I can even simplify this a bit more by removing the assignment here and just returning the result of the switch expression. Now, using the lambda style arrows is one way to assign the value, but you can also use another approach. You can use the colon that we're used to if you just love a colon, but you need to follow it with the word yield. Okay, so yeah, this is a bit more verbose. So I prefer to use the arrow, but I'll show you in a moment where yield comes in handy. Now, you can specify more than one case, which is really helpful since fall through. That was one of my big questions when I first learned about this. Like, yeah, fall through has gotten me in trouble, but sometimes I want to fall through. Like, there's valid cases for fall through, right? So notice here, we're saying if the customer name is John or Demo, which is his last name, then the ID is 12212. So again, that makes up for the removal of fall through from switch expressions because you can indicate all of the cases that should get this value delimited by a comma. All right. So you can do more than just assign values in switch expression. For example, here we're using the lambda style arrow followed by a set of curly braces to indicate that we want to do more than just that one assignment. So inside of the body of this case, we can add more statements like this one. But here's where yield comes in handy. The last line of the case must yield a value to be returned, right? Because again, this is an assignment. So if you're going to do more than assign, your last thing you do should be that assignment, okay? So let's talk about the rules for switch expressions. You'll need to use the arrows or the colon yield. You can't use both like this. All right. So line 3 would give you a compilation error because it's a different case from line 2, which you started with. You can use the yield with the arrows, but only in events like the last case where you're using the curly braces to execute multiple statements. So in that case, I would have the arrow for John, and then I could do the colon, but I need the curly brace and then the rest of the stuff, okay? All right. You can use any of the cases to throw an exception as well. So, of course, in those cases, no value is going to be returned for the ID because the entire flow is interrupted by the exception. So, in this case, I'm throwing an exception for the default case. It doesn't have to just be default. It could be any of these. It could be multiple of these. So if I wanted to throw an exception for Mary and throw a different exception for default or throw the same exception, all of that is perfectly valid. Now, this is not a replacement for the switch statement. It's an addition to the language, meaning you can still use switch statements. And in some cases, that might be the more favorable option. As a rule of thumb, use expressions when you're using switch to assign a value, and use statements when you're not using switch to assign, but just to invoke statements. All right, let's go back to our test now. And we're going to go inside of this get accounts method, which is an API call. So this method is making a get call to get all of the accounts for the specified customer. It's then deserializing the response into an array of account objects. And let's look at the response for this call. Notice here we have an array of these account objects, and each account has an ID, a customer ID, a type, and a balance. So I have this Pojo class that has nothing but these fields as well as getters and setters. And for any of you who have created Pojos, which are plain old Java objects, meaning they just contain some fields and some getters and setter methods, any of you who have created this, you know that this is a tedious thing to do, right? This is that boilerplate stuff we start getting slapped on the wrist for in Java. Many people have moved to using the Lombok external library so that they don't have to write all of this code. But in Java 14, a new construct has been introduced called records. So this is a record, much shorter, right? I know. So notice here, instead of using the word class, we use the word record. Also, as opposed to opening this with a curly brace like we would do in a class, we use parentheses to declare the fields. So you specify the fields and their data types in this comma delimited list. Then you close it with a closing paren and a set of curly braces. And that's it. You don't need to make any getters. You don't need to make any setters. You don't need to override the inherited methods like equals and hash code or toString. It's all just done for you. And it's done quite nicely, I might add. However, if you just want to override anything, you can do so within the curly braces of record. Right? So when I showed you before, it was just an empty set of curly braces, but you can go inside of there. You can add additional implementation. You can override stuff. You can do whatever you want to do inside of there. Well, not whatever you want to do, because I'll tell you in a moment. But records can be instantiated just like classes. So account is the name of our record. And we use the new keyword and call the constructor passing in all of the values, okay? The fields of a record are final. So that's what I meant when I say don't do whatever you want to do. So there are no set methods generated for records. And of course, technically you can add a setter within the curly braces of a record, but I don't see a good reason to do this since the fields are final and cannot be modified anyway. Okay, now you do have accessor methods. However, they don't start with the word get. Instead, the accessor method name is the same as the field name. So notice here I'm saying account.balance as opposed to account.getBalance. Now, records were released as a preview feature in the current version of Java, which is Java 14. That was released in March. And what this means by it being a preview feature is that it's not yet a permanent feature of the language. So it's just available for us developers to play around with and offer some feedback before it's final in the language, which is wonderful. Okay. Based on that feedback, the implementation of this can change. So I say all of that to say, don't use this in production code just yet. All right. That also means that support from external libraries may not be available just yet. For example, when I was writing this talk, the Jackson library didn't have support yet. So I used Jackson to deserialize that JSON response into this record. But there wasn't the support to do it organically. So as a hack, I needed to explicitly bind each of these fields to its respective JSON property. However, I saw a tweet maybe a day or two ago from Jackson saying that support was available, but I haven't had a chance to play with that yet. So I'm going to play with that and see if I can get rid of these explicit bindings here. But yeah, so some of your external libraries might not be equipped to handle preview features, right? Okay, the next thing that I would love to show you are text blocks. So let's continue on with this API. What if instead of calling the API, we instead wanted to just mock the data right there in the API util class? To represent this whole thing as a string would be very tedious, right? We need to escape all of the fields because they're already in quotation marks, and we need to add these new line characters for each line break, and we need to add like these plus signs for each line. It's just ugly. It's ugly to read. It's ugly to write. Text blocks, Thank you. Text blocks allow you to use 3 quotation marks to open and close a big block of text. So notice here, oh, it's so beautiful. Look at this. You don't need to escape anything. The individual quotation marks, they're still there on the fields. The line breaks are respected, right? Oh, it's just a beautiful, beautiful thing. Text blocks were introduced in Java 13 as a preview feature, and then we got a second preview in the latest release, Java 14. So this also is not a permanent feature just yet, but it is slated to become a permanent feature in the next release of Java, which is September 15th. How many days is that? I don't know, a couple of days. So we'll give us like 2 weeks, and then this will be permanent. So woo, let's clap. Very nice. Okay, let's talk about some rules and some guidelines for text blocks. You cannot include the entire text blocks on the same line, or you're going to get a compilation error, right? A new line must be after the opening quotes, like in this second example here. Now, this is legal, but this looks a little goofy, right? So this is not the preferred way. Legal, but not preferred. The preferred way is to have both the opening and the closing quotes aligned on their own individual lines, and then the text block in the middle, okay? Now, I had to fit all of this on a single slide, which is why it's a short text. But if you have like this simple text like this, do not put this in a text block, right? That's overkill, right? This could be just a simple string. Okay, one more thing that I want to show you in that API class. So let's say that we didn't want the entire response, but we wanted to just return a hard-coded list of expected account IDs. The old way of doing this would be to use the arrays.asList method. However, in Java 9, this of method was introduced for all of the entities in the collection framework. So lists, maps, sets, etc. This one seems small, but I've actually been enjoying it quite a bit. And I think the reason I'm enjoying it so much is because it took like a small cognitive effort to recall which class do I use to make a quick list, right? So is it array dot of? Is it arrays plural dot of? It was always like this little kind of doubt. But now I want a list, I call list dot of. I want a map, I call map dot of. Nice and straightforward. And speaking of maps, populating these used to require a separate method call for each item that we want to add to the collection. Now, you can define a map all with one line of code. So the parameters are key followed by value. And you see here we have 3 entries for this map all on one line. Now, I did that because I wanted to show off and give you the wow effect, but this reads a little bit confusing to me. Like for the 3 it's fine, but again, there's that little bit of cognitive effort. So in practice, I actually split each of the key value pairs onto their own lines. So as far as space in the IDE, I'm probably using about the same number of lines. I read a tweet yesterday where someone was talking about number of lines of code being a horrible metric. Yes. So that would be a way if you have a boss that's measuring you on line numbers, go ahead and break that up into 3 separate lines. And now you got, a couple more lines to add. But for real, I usually break those up into key value pairs, each on an individual line, so that it's easier to read for me. But if you want to hit them with that wicked one-liner and it's just a couple of entries, I won't judge you. All right. So one thing to note about using the of method is that it creates this collection which is immutable. What this means is that the collection cannot be changed by adding, removing, or sorting it later. So only use this when your collection won't require any changes later on in the program. All right. So there you have it. These are a few of my favorite new features from recent versions of Java. I've been using them in different projects, and I find them quite useful, even for test code. Okay, so I'm looking forward to Java 15, which again is September 15th, and to explore some more new features. It really feels like Christmas every 6 months in Java land. All right. So what questions can I answer for you? I think we're going to need to head over to Slack for the questions. Is the MC available for further directions?
Yeah, we're here. That was great. Thanks, Angie.
I forgot to mention, because it's so new, I am a Java champion. That I'm one of the newest ones. So yay for that. Really exciting stuff. Also, I'm a principal developer advocate at Amplitude and the director of Test Automation University, which is a platform with all free courses on everything testing. If you need to reach out to me, I blog on angiejones.tech. I have techniques and strategies on doing test automation effectively. And Test Automation University's link is right there as well. And then you can find me on Twitter, where I live, at TechGirl1908. Okay, thank you so much.
All right, that was awesome. Thanks, Angie. It was exciting to hear about the power that can be wielded with the newer versions of Java. I know that some of you are going to have some of those questions and want to know more about this, so be sure to join the Q&A session that's starting right now. Just click on the link in the session breakout page and you'll get there. So we'll start again in just about 20 minutes or so, see you then.